Welcome to Scotch Talk. Just that there. We're here with James Ward, and I'm John Rose.
And this is Glenn Livett.
That's our friend Glenn Livett. It's a Saturday afternoon in Denver, and we got together for Scotch Talk on Flex, where today we're going to cover some content about what's relevant in Flex for managers and architects. James travels the world for Adobe Systems talking about Flex, and we thought we'd sit down and cover some of the common questions that come up from the architects that he comes across.
Yeah.
And hopefully this will be informative and fun.
I hope so.
Should we sponsor Chet here?
I think we should.
Chet, we couldn't decide where to put this in, but this broadcast is officially sponsored by When I Am King by Chet Haase. James, where can you find Chet's blog?
At chetchat.blogspot.com.
Thank you. So Chet, we want to see our commission on any books sold this week.
Thanks, Chet.
All right. So James, we should get down to business. Enjoy your scotch still, but can you tell us about? Just kind of give, for those that haven't really taken the deep dive into Flex, give them the high level of what's available to them, what that architecture looks like, what they have in a tooling perspective, and those things.
Yeah, definitely. So for architects, we think about our systems and what they look like, the topology. So just to give a brief overview of what that looks like with Flex. Flex uses client-side runtimes in order to execute our applitions in. And then also servers that will hold all of our back-end services for talking to our databases and talking to other enterprise systems, whatever. So really we're kind of back to the client-server model, where we have our clients, these are stateful clients, we have our servers. The only difference is that we're not talking directly to the database anymore like we did in the old days. We're talking to an application server that is then talking back to our database. So this is really following the SOA paradigm, where that services layer in the middle is exposing services out to our client application, potentially out to third parties as well, and then our back end, and then it's also doing all the calls back to our back end database, to our ESBs, and all the other things that we have going on back there.
All right.
So then on the client side, we have in Flex, we have two major runtimes today. There's Flash Player if you're in the browser, and there's Air if you're on the desktop. So you can deploy either in the web browser or on the desktop. It's going to use the same virtual machine whether you're in those. There's additional functionality available to you if you're in Air on the desktop. But there's really those two client virtual machines that you actually execute your client-side application in. And then running on the client, you make network requests back to the server, to your app server, to your services layer, that then makes the calls back to your backend database.
And can those network requests be anything? Are they HTTP? What's the typical?
They can really be anything, but typically they're HTTP. They can be web services, so just plain old XML, JSON, really anything you want. But they could also just be socket-based. So if you did want to build on top of some existing socket API, you could do that, assuming that you can actually make the network connection from client to server. So HTTP is usually open through firewalls and through proxies, but other protocols may not be.
So I'm deploying to either Flash Player or the Air runtime. What's the programming language I'm using?
So that's a great point. So there's the runtimes, Flash Player and Air, but to build for those runtimes, you have to use a tool to compile down to the bytecode format for those runtimes. So Flex is Adobe's tool to do that. It's an open source tool. We also have the commercial product Flex Builder that wraps the Flex SDK, the open source Flex SDK. And the Flex SDK includes all the components that you need to build your application. So things like a data grid and a combo box and charts and those sorts of things. So those are in the SDK. And then you use a programming language, two different ones actually, MXML and ActionScript. MXML is XML dialect, and it's really just a declarative language. So by declarative, what I mean is that all that it's doing is instantiating objects and it's setting properties on them, and that's it.
Okay.
So the underlying language is ActionScript. It's an object-oriented language, so it's really not a scripted language. It's object-oriented, has interfaces. You can extend other classes and all the typical things that you'd expect in an OO language. So really, ActionScript is the core language. The compiler, what it does is it takes your MXML, so the Flex compiler takes MXML, converts it into ActionScript, and then takes all the ActionScript and converts it into bytecode.
Okay. So that's the client side then,
Right.
And you talked a bit about tools like Flex Builder. What is there? You also have some products on the server side, correct? Too, that are optional to help building Flex applications.
Yeah, exactly. So there are lots of ways that you can connect to the back end. Anything that can expose XML or talk XML over HTTP, you can connect to from Flex. So if you have a struts application, just make your views talk XML and you're up and running with Flex. But if you want to have a more optimized format, both optimized in communication and optimized in terms of development time, then you can use one of Adobe's products for doing what we call remoting. So there's two products. There's Lifecycle Data Services and Blaze DS.
Okay.
And Blaze DS is just an open source part of Lifecycle Data Services. So we took two pieces of Lifecycle Data Services, a commercial product, open source those as Blaze DS. So the two major pieces in Blaze DS are remoting, so that's just the ability to make method calls on objects on your backend or services on your backend if you're using Spring Services or UGB session needs or just POJOs. So you make method calls on those, and then we send the response back across the wire.
So you're describing very Java-based things. So Blaze and both Lifecycle are deployed into a servlet container.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you wanted to deploy Lifecycle Data Services or Blaze in your environment, you just add some jar files to your WebEnv-lib, make a few changes to your web XML, and now you're up and running. If you want to have the same functionality with non-Java backends, there are open source libraries and products out there to do this to do the same thing with .NET, PHP, Ruby, Python, everything. So yeah.
From a common deployment standpoint, we're looking at the client side, runtimes, Flash and Air. You've got some tools which are Flex Builder. You've got the Flex SDK, which is part of Flex Builder. I'm writing an ActionScript and XML to build things.
Right.
And then for my backend services, you offer me some remoting options if I don't already have a SOA like backend, Blaze or Lifecycle.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and there definitely are advantages we can talk about later to using Blaze DS and an optimized protocol between the client and the server.
Okay. I wanted to jump into the standards conversation a bit.
Yeah.
Earlier this summer, Joel on Software, one of the real predominant voices in the industry, called Flash and the Flex kind of application model not webby. So jumping into that a bit, and what kind of, how does Adobe view Flash from a standards perspective, and how do you guys fit there and compare to other options for building applications?
Yeah, standards are definitely very important to Adobe. If you look at our past with PDF, PDF is now an ISO standard. It's being used for governments to have statements of records for the next hundreds of years, and really it's a format that Adobe really wanted to standardize so that the world could rely on that to always be around, to always be available. And with our Flash based technologies, Flash and Air and Flex, we're continuing in that same direction. We haven't open sourced or open standard gone to a standards body with these technologies yet, but it's, this is a pattern that Adobe has gone down for a long time. We don't make money on the runtimes, so it's foreseeable that we may at some point in the future go down the same road as PDF.
What about from a user experience perspective? It is obviously a different user experience. Obviously, some think that's a better user experience, but would of course be somewhat true that it's not your standard web experience. Do you have thoughts on what that means to users, and is that important? Is it good that we've moved beyond that?
Yeah, a lot of times people are excited with Flex because they can easily create the desktop-like experience in the browser, and that's something that they want to do. When they moved from client-server architectures to the web, they lost a lot of the greatness that you can get on the desktop.
Sure.
And so the ability to create desktop-like experiences in the web browser is something that excites a lot of people. But like you're saying, for end users, this could be a hindrance. So they're in the web browser and all of a sudden they start experiencing things like the desktop. It can be confusing. And so I think that what needs to emerge over the next 5, maybe 10 years is a cross-vendor, cross-organization committee that helps to standardize some of the UI patterns that are emerging with rich internet applications, just to make users' lives easier, so that when I go into an autocomplete combo box, that it works the same way, no matter if the technology is Silverlight, Ajax, or Flex. It really should work the same way. We need to standardize those UI patterns so that the end users don't have to figure out how to use all these different new ways of interacting with software. So I think that's something that our software industry needs to address over the next few years.
It's definitely a whole conversation of its own, and what that would mean, and what the synergies be there. So without getting stuck in that, let's jump down the list here. Assuming that the architects and managers out there going, okay, interesting, I kind of understand what it means to build for Flex. Can you talk to us about the realistic costs? I know that often we hear, oh, you can build a Flex application for free, and I don't know that's realistic that I can use Notepad and write my own ant script and things like that. Not that it's not doable, but if I want to build a production app, can you talk to us about the cost on the tool side, and then also what our options are in the server, and I know that that's more optional, but can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. So definitely Adobe is in the business to make money in general, but primarily with tooling. We provide professional tooling around our free runtimes. So if you look back at PDF, Acrobat costs money, but Reader is free. And so this is the same model that we're going with Flex, is that the professional tooling costs money, the runtimes are free. With Flex, we've even gone a step further and said, all right, even the core part of Flex is free as well. So that's the Flex SDK. But really, like you're saying, to do professional, productive development, you probably want to pay for the professional tooling. It's going to pay for itself because you're going to be more productive than if you weren't using the professional tooling. But it's up to you. I mean, if you did really want to save money and didn't want to purchase Flex Builder, you don't have to do that to build Flex applications. But most people are going to. And that's great, because then we can invest more back into the platform and really make this a great platform for building applications on. And that's what we're doing. So it's I think we're trying our best to find the balance between what we give away for free and what we charge for, and continuing to invest in the platform and its growth.
Along that, it's been kind of a lot of things have changed over the last couple of years with what you guys do give away for free and what you charge for. Do you think you guys have finally found the spot that you're going to live in there, or should we expect to see more changes?
I think there will continue to be evolution. I think that we're not stuck in the dirt and saying this is as far as we'll go. I think we're always open to feedback and hearing if this is a major roadblock for people to adopt Flex, then we want to hear that, and if it is, then maybe we can make adjustments. So I think that we're always trying to figure out what's the best thing for developers, and we want them using our technologies, and however we can do that, we're going to try to accommodate them.
So you said earlier that you have Blaze DS and Lifecycle, and so can you talk to us about what the limitations are of Lifecycle, and I don't know if you can go into or not, but the pricing. Sorry, the limitations on Blaze compared to Lifecycle, and then the pricing on Lifecycle.
So Lifecycle Data Services is licensed as an enterprise product. It's licensed per CPU. There's different levels of licensing depending on how many concurrent users you'll have and those sorts of things. But it's really an enterprise licensed product. And then Blaze DS is open source, so it's free. But there are some things in Blaze DS that don't exist in Lifecycle Data Services. This is a pretty common model that you see Red Hat and a lot of the other vendors using, MySQL, and even now the Spring guys, right?
Yep.
So I think this is a pretty common model, and it's working well for us. The major limitations in Blaze are that there isn't a scalable push channel to send messages. So one of the features of Blaze and Lifecycle Data Services is push out to the client, and to do that in a scalable way, today Lifecycle Data Services is really the only way to do that.
So here's an interesting question. When that's your model and you open source Blaze, what if someone from the community contributed that solution? Would Adobe incorporated into Blaze, or is that their competitive advantage for lifecycle?
I think we'll always find a balance there. I mean, if someone wanted to contribute it, I don't see why we would reject it if it worked well and was something we could really integrate in a good way. There are other options out there like Granite Data Services that people can use if they want that sort of functionality in a non-Adobe supported product. So I think that people, if they feel that they don't want to work with Adobe because we want to maintain our competitive advantage, which I'm not sure if that's even true in this case, but if we did, and someone felt that way, they could go to other open source products and work with them.
So what about the other direction? One of the things that's popular in Granite is the Hibernate support and lazy loading from a client side, even though you're in a different programming language, a different VM. Do you think we'll see that in Blaze anytime soon, or in Lifecycle?
It's in Lifecycle Data Services, lazy loading and paging and those sorts of features. I think that we'll see more of those kind of commodity, kind of necessary for everybody features percolate down to the open source products. I think that's pretty standard for how commercial open source mixtures work, and there will continue to be a balance there. And we'll continue to innovate in newer and better and more exciting things as well. That Lifecycle Data Services will have that Blaze won't. So.
Okay. Well, so moving on to the question of, you've got different levels of application. I've heard Stefan Jansen, the founder of Parlays.com, say a number of times that he really likes Flex, but he's not sure he would use it for a large-scale application or, ERP kind of is the right example he hits on. Do you think that's a valid concern? Do you think that there's a point where you shouldn't be using Flex, certain sizes of application?
Right.
Kind of speak to that and what happens as your code base grows in Flex?
Right. I think that there definitely are people building very large applications with Flex that are in production, and so for instance, there's a hospital application that is gigantic. I mean, it's millions of lines of code, all built in Flex, and it's in production in hospitals around the world. It's working great, but you do have to think about where your bottlenecks are going to be, where your risks are. And in a traditional web programming model, we know where our risks are. We know that if we stuff 10 megs into every user session and we have to replicate that across the cluster, we have scalability issues, right?
Sure.
So it's well understood where the scalability problems exist in typical web applications. For rich internet applications, it's not as well understood where the risks are and what we need to kind of be concerned about up front. So for instance, when you move a lot of your state to the client and a lot of your processing, now you're doing more on the client. You have to start thinking about memory leaks on the client and how do I effectively manage resources on the client and not overload this client. There are ways to architect your Flex applications so that you do this well. There's an open source framework called Anvil, which is really helping you to modularize your Flex application. So you break it into pieces so that things can be unloaded and loaded in a modular fashion. And really these types of architectures and products are what's going to help us to build those applications and not run into those problems that we could if we were building everything in a monolithic manner. So I think that what's happened is, as we move to richer applications, we're taking some of our problems that we learned how to deal with on the server, and we're moving them to the client, and we're having to think ahead and figure out how do we really deal with those problems in a client-server model rather than having everything on the server. The server is a lot better, a lot easier to scale than a client is. You can't tell someone to upgrade their machine. A server, you could in a lot of cases throw more machines at it. Not in all cases, in the case of a 10 meg per user session, you can't throw more machines at it and solve the problem. But certainly you can in lots of cases throw hardware at problems on the server and solve them.
So do you think as an industry we're still learning how to solve those problems, or do you think that the solutions are out there, they just haven't made their way out into the masses?
I think that in general, they just haven't made their way out to the masses. But I think that there are still some problems that we need to figure out.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that things like as we want more advanced advanced data visualizations, as we want the client to be doing more and loading more information on the client. There's problems that are just really hard to solve. So if I have 1 million records that I want to load onto the client and I want to do a sort, do I load all 1 million rows down to the client, do the sort on the client, because that's how we typically do it in Flex? Or do I do the sort on the server and somehow determine the heuristic for when I do it on the server, when I do it on the client?
Can you restate that so people don't think it was the Scotch talking? You take the 1 million rows down to the client and sort them?
You could do it that way.
Okay. And that's really a viable option in a Flex application?
It could be, depending on your data set.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an option, but maybe that's not the way you want to do it. Maybe you want to have some heuristic where if I'm over 100,000 rows, then I do it on the server because my Oracle database can do that much faster than the client can.
But it is definitely kind of new options and new choices, right? The idea of sending 100,000 or 1 million rows down to a browser, nobody would even contemplate. So with each runtime, you may have different options and different constraints that you want to consider.
Yeah, certainly. And I think another place where this comes up really often is in online, offline applications, or occasionally connected or occasionally disconnected applications, where with Air, because you're running on the desktop, you can run these applications offline. But there's this major problem. Let's say that I have a rules engine on my server that it has massive amounts of information in it that's determining what happens on the client. I can't take those rules, or let's say even in a simpler case, I just have simple business logic for validating a credit card number. Am I going to move that logic to the client for the offline use case? Am I going to have it exist on both sides of the wire?
Sure.
So the offline online thing, I think, is one place where we are really kind of in new water and need to think more about how we're going to make all this work.
Yeah, a lot of new problems come with that.
Definitely.
So as a rule, you wouldn't say that it's inherent that Flex or any other client-side technology means that your code's unmaintainable. It's learning how to use older patterns or new patterns to solve those problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think SOA is a big part of this, at least in the online use case. SOA SOA and RA fit great together in the online use case, because if I can break up my backend into services and expose those services out to the client, now I'm just essentially building a client for those services.
So you touched on a hospital client, if I remember correctly. Did they fill in these pains? Is there any examples you could pull from their experiences to relate to us, and some of the maybe a major pain point they felt in the solution, or some sort of tangible example of what we're kind of talking about here?
Yeah, I think that one of the places where they felt this, their application is all online, but they definitely had to go with a modular application architecture.
Okay.
If they were to take all of their code and compile it down into a single application, that application would be over 700 megs, I think it was, and that's just not feasible. So what they did was they built an architecture where this is a very CRUD style application.
Yeah.
So I go into a patient record and then I can drill down into this information. So they created it in such a way that as I drill down into this information, it's actually loading additional modules for the application into memory. As I navigate out of those, it's unloading them.
Are those RSL modules? Is that
just modules, Flex
Okay.
modules? Yeah. So it allowed them to have this this paradigm where, first of all, the end user doesn't have to load a 700 meg Swift file in order to run the application.
important?
And second of all, managing memory, because if I was to have all that in one giant Swift file, the startup time is probably going to be outrageous, the memory consumption is going to be outrageous, so they really need to go with a modular application architecture. That's what they built from the start, and they were successful because of this.
Is that application deploying to Flash or Air?
This one is Flash in the browser, actually.
Would there be any challenges with the modularity to go to Air, or would it still port right over?
That's a great question. So there are some complications with doing modular applications in Air. Air has a code signing model that says that all of my pieces, all of my executable code, at least that executes in the privileged sandbox in Air, is going to be inside of the Air file that gets signed. Okay. So what this means is that I have to package, if I want my modules to be able to be in the privileged sandbox in Air, they have to be packaged into the Air file and signed. So I can't update my modules without creating an entirely new Air file and signing that Air file. So there is a way to load modules if you're okay with them not being in the privileged sandbox.
So it would, all reality of what I'm hearing is it would be a different architecture to take that application and deploy it in air.
It would be, yeah. If you wanted to do it right, it would be.
Interesting. So is that generally true? Or more often than not, can it take an application that I built for just the Flash player and deploy it to air?
Most of the time you can take an application that was built for Flash Player for the browser and use it in air. Most of the time though, people are going to air because they want some air specific functionality, so that then they have to go in and add some functionality to their application.
I have this data, they're saying they want it in Excel, I want to go and add that drag and drop behavior to my data grid.
Right.
But I'm really then just changing that piece of my application,
Right.
not my entire architecture.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
I think that's an important point because
You do get into major architectural changes when you go to offline scenarios.
yeah, and
If you ever intend to be offline capable and you start building without the pre-thinking that you will be offline, you can run into some major challenges when you decide that your application needs to work offline.
and it sounds like offline nature of whether it's air or any other RA is a great topic for another Scotch Talk because it's very involved and it seems like there's a lot of choices you have to make depending on your application.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So let's jump ahead then. Next thing I want to talk about is compiler performance.
Right.
It's one thing I've personally felt some pain with my own Flex development, and that sometimes just isn't as fast as you want it to be.
Yeah.
I won't quantify my numbers because I don't want to give you too hard a time, but
I can quantify some numbers.
well, and maybe would you do that for us? And would you also maybe talk to us a little about what as a developer I need to know about the Flex compiler? And I'm building applications through Flex Builder, so I don't write an app and it builds. So I mean, can you maybe give us as much background as you think we need, and what we can expect that's coming down the line to maybe solve some of those things for us?
Yeah. So compiler performance is something that people building large Flex applications have major issues with. There's an instance of a company where they actually have 2 machines for each developer, and so that while they're compiling, they can switch over to the other machine and can continue working, and then when the compile is done, switch back. And so it's not a good model. We know it's a major problem. We're working on it for Flex 4. There are some things that you can do to make this better using library projects in Flex. So if you create library projects where you split up certain parts of your application into specific libraries, and those are stagnant pieces that you don't have to recompile every time, that can certainly help save some compile time.
Is that the same type of modules we were talking about a minute ago, or is that a different?
They're different. Library projects and modules are separate. There's a few different concepts for how you architect larger Flex applications. There's libraries, which are just reusable blocks of classes. Then there's modules, which are blocks of classes that you actually want to load at runtime later. And you can have when you create a module, it can have classes for multiple libraries, and so it's really up to you how you architect all this. But things like Anvil, the Anvil project, will help you figure out how to best do this. It's definitely something you need somebody senior to help you think about when you're going into building a large application, how you create your library projects, how you create your modules, and those sorts of things.
So we'll see the big compiler performance gain in Flex 4?
That's what I'm told. We'll
okay.
Yeah,
we'll put it on your shoulders to
it's
go back.
It's a major focus for Flex 4.
Awesome.
There's probably actually a bug or feature request on bugs.adobe.com/flex where people could go vote for this if this is something they
vote for your bugs.
Yeah, definitely go vote for your bugs.
We see the evangelists picking out their favorite pain points of hearing about voting them. Vote for your bugs. So if you follow these guys at all, you'll know that there's a few bugs that each of them are passionate about. So let's move on from compiler to, I think most architects and managers care about testing because most of them care about quality.
Hopefully.
Yeah, and I think that all of our audience certainly does, without a doubt. So maybe you can talk a bit about what's available in Flexion and some of the other unit testing frameworks. I'd also like to get into a bit of what's available for functional testing. I personally feel like the value of unit testing within a UI is, there's certainly some places where it absolutely provides value, but it's not giving me the kind of value that it would on my server-side Java code.
Right.
So, and of course there's different types of testing, but thinking more about functional testing. So maybe start from, I know that Flex Unit is an Adobe thing, so start from there and kind of go through the options. And also another important question here is I think this is another cost point for managers.
Right.
So maybe you can touch a bit on that.
Yeah, so for unit testing specifically, Flex Unit is the most popular one. There are other frameworks out there as well, DP Unit and quite a few others for doing unit testing. But like you said, in a UI, how much value does it really add to do unit testing on UI? It depends. If you're building a framework like the Flex SDK with lots of components that need to be consistently work, then unit testing can be important. The Flex SDK has its own internal unit testing framework that it uses to test the Flex components.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's something that other people would be useful for other people to use. Maybe if they're building their own framework, it would be. But for unit testing, typical Flex applications, if you have moved logic from the server to the client, that might be a place where unit testing would be valuable, especially if you're in air and you have things going on to the local database or things that can break, when certain things change. So also just testing interfaces. The interfaces are remaining consistent might be something that would be valuable. In Flex, there's the traditional MVC pattern for components. You have your view, you have your controller, how the thing's actually working, and it may be valuable to test the controller piece, and it may be valuable to test the model piece. Testing that your model hasn't changed in some way that would break your application.
Okay.
So those are the places where I could see unit testing being valuable. There certainly are people out there doing quite a bit of unit testing on Flex applications.
Yeah.
I think as you mentioned, the more valuable testing to be done is functional testing and integration testing. So actually testing the UI, simulating a user clicking through the application and making sure things don't break. And there's, in Flex, there is the automation APIs for doing automated testing of Flex. There's an open source product for using Selenium to do automated testing of Flex applications, but then a number of the vendors building automated testing applications. So there is Mercury, QTP, there is IBM's product, Borland's product, or wait, no, is IBM's product now? Did they purchase? No, HP
Lots of
purchased
mergers in
Mercury.
that space. I
Yeah,
can't keep it straight.
HP purchased Mercury. So
Yeah.
HP's product, IBM's product, Borland's product. I think they all support functional testing, automated testing on Flex applications. And you guys had a project too.
Yeah, we have my company Grow Logic. We also have a project called Flex Monkey that gives you the open source version of record and playback and generates Flex unit tests. But what I was going to say is I think that Mercury, they're viewing that very much as a QA tool, correct?
Right.
So there is like another interesting conversation on where the lines are as you move to the client side. I think there is an interesting conversation on what's developer testing, because typical developer testing is unit testing, but really as a developer I want some level of a functional test that's a safety net, and that's why we built Flex Monkey.
Right.
But and maybe they do the exact same thing as Mercury. I've not actually used Mercury, but because of the price tag, which I'll hit on here in a minute.
Yeah.
But there is probably a line that gets blurred there in terms of who's doing. What hat is it the QA person wearing the hat? And hopefully it's somewhat of both. But I know from my research it sounded like Mercury was in the 5,000 to 10,000 range. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I don't know the exact pricing on the tools, but certainly if you purchase an automated testing tool like Mercury or the Borland's tool, it does cost money.
Yeah.
And
I wanted to bring that up in this chat because I think that's relevant.
IT managers need to know about ahead of time.
Even if there's an option for developers, and I think we've provided one, there's still I think that cost that they need to put in their budget.
Certainly.
And hopefully that's not a huge cost if you look at your overall budget, but I know that when I tell my boss he's got to spend $10,000, that's news that could have come sooner rather than later. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's a lot more to talk about on testing, but I think since we're kind of trying to do the architect level, let's jump ahead to performance, because that's always, we've talked a little about it, and you've got some client-side things. So I was going to ask you at this time in context of comparison, I know this summer there was quite a few little, I don't want to call them blog wars, but conversation from Curl's perspective on their comparison to Flash. But maybe you can talk about performance, how it compares to Silverlight, Ajax, Curl. I put etc. I don't know what else to throw on that list, but how you guys compare. And I know there's also the protocol side. And I don't know that you specifically called out AMF earlier, so maybe you could circle back around on that's the protocol that comes with Blaze and those things, and cover that too.
Yeah, so definitely for performance, there's a lot of benchmarks out there for benchmarking the different virtual machines, Silverlights, then the Ajax performance with the JavaScript interpreters and now VMs, and the Flash virtual machine and curl. A lot of them, actually I think almost all of them that I've seen are very low level tests, and what I think is that it's important to do a more holistic kind of big perspective performance test and look at, all right, it's great that your bubble sort may run 10 milliseconds faster in another virtual machine, but really how is that really going to impact my overall application performance? And this is something where I feel like we've done a great job with Flex in that we don't just focus on optimizing our VM, we're also focusing on optimizing the protocol for how we're communicating between the client and the server. So that optimized protocol is called AMF. It's just a serialization protocol, binary format that you can stuff into HTTP so that Blaze DS and Lifecycle Data Services and lots of other open source products use AMF as their transport between client and server. It's a very efficient protocol. It does some basic compression in the protocol by itself, so you may not have to use gzip if you have large data structures you're shipping back and forth across the wire. So AMF is just one of those ways that we're optimizing the more holistic picture, the more application level performance. And then also, one of the great things about AMF is that it also is much faster to turn objects in memory into AMF than it is to turn objects in memory into text and then gzip that text. So this is something that I point out on my census benchmark application, jamesward.com/census, where we look at, all right, what's the amount of time that it takes to get my data from the database, serialize it into various technologies, transfer that across the wire, or gzip potentially, transfer it across the wire, ungzip it, unserialize it or deserialize it, and then parse it if it needs to be parsed like XML, and then actually render that data. So that's a holistic picture of something that we do very often in our software. And in those cases, in all the technologies that I've tested, Flex has come out very well compared to the other technologies.
So you're basically saying that if you take the typical use case, much more of your time to deliver X data to the screen is on going to the server, getting it back, parsing it, and then the UI displaying it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it's great if you've optimized some low-level function in your VM, but if that's not helping the overall picture very much, then it's not that useful. So I think that what we need to do is talk more about how are these VMs, how are the communication protocols really helping us, our overall application to perform better. So with that said, there certainly are ways in Flex that you can get in trouble with performance. So some of those ways are with complex item renderers. So as your DOM tree, so Flex is built on a DOM model where you add display objects to display objects to display objects. And the deeper those trees get, the more your performance degrades. And so you certainly have to be cognizant of that when you're building your application and figure out how to optimize those trees. And just like any other programming model, you definitely you don't want to have to deal with this up front, but you certainly want to have it in the back of your head when you're building.
So in your example, Flex developer, it's very nice to throw a data grid on the screen and wow, I have data and I didn't do any work. And compared to other languages, it's nice. And they say, oh, I can put in a custom renderer. And so if I put in a bunch of custom renderers, I've got what? Display times, number of columns in display times renderers.
Yeah, I met with a client a while back who wanted to put a data grid inside of a data grid inside of a data grid It's always data graded. As deep as the user wanted to navigate. And my first question was, my first response was, we can do that. The second response was, I'm not sure that that's the best way for the user to experience the data. And then the third thing was, you will probably have performance problems if you go this route. So usually, the interesting thing is that usually as your DOM tree of objects gets deeper, your UI complexity is also increasing, and you're creating a worse experience for your end user. So really this comes down to designers really coming up with designs that are not as complicated as data grids within data grids within data grids within data grids.
It's kind of exciting though, because it's interesting how many different times just in this chat that there are new choices that we have to become informed about. And even to that point, I remember talking to you a while back, like an hour ago, about how we didn't even think about a lot of this stuff when we were building HTML applications. That just getting the HTML and kind of traditional browser apps to do what we want. One, we didn't even have to think, or didn't have the time or maybe wherewithal to think about, this would be better for the user experience. And now it's, there's of course a technical limitation or choice there, but it's also about what's going to work best for the user. Right? And I think that's really exciting that we now have a platform, or platforms, I think a number of the client-side platforms that allow us to think about more what the user needs, not just can I get the data to them on the screen.
Absolutely. I think that's really what the heart of what return applications are about, is that we want users to have a better experience with software. And if all that we're doing is taking what we did in the web, or taking what we did in desktop applications and rebuilding a new technology, we're kind of missing the point. And really the best thing about return applications is having the ability to rethink how we build applications, how users interact with applications.
Well, and I respect your position at Adobe, but going back to one of the first questions we asked on not webby enough, and for me that's what it's about, is that I don't want to build that web application. I want to deliver it through the web because that brings so many advantages, but I want to give them an application that's far beyond that. So
use the browser as the application delivery, but don't use the HTML controls as the UI for your
and I know that's a heavily debated point, but certainly for me, and getting to actually interact with users at times, they're far more excited about this kind of application than the other. So we don't have to get too far into that. I want to keep going on the kind of architect level conversation. Blaze DS talked about a little bit about that it's a scaled down version of Lifecycle. You said there's not a real legitimate push solution. Can you talk about the connection limit problem there and what level of deployment I could look at Blaze as an option for there? In addition, let's kind of go over Blaze and security and those things too.
Yeah, sure. So Blaze has two main features, remoting and messaging. And remoting scales the same way whether you're in Lifecycle Data Services or you're in Blaze. Okay. It's the same. The difference is that when I go into messaging, where I actually want to push messages out to the client in real time, to have efficient push, we really need to get away from having a thread per connection on our server. So if you look at how our Java servers are built, all of them use currently, with the exception of some new work going into like Jetty and Tomcat 6, and I think WebLogic is doing some things as well. And even the Servlet 3 specification is working on standardizing this. But today, the primary way that connections are handled is thread per connection. And because of this, Tomcat has like a 200 or something connection, 200 connection thread connection pool that connections
per instance. Is
So,
that a configurable thing?
It is configurable, but these are tied to threads, and spawning massive numbers of threads is not efficient either.
So Apache configurations.
And so what Java did, I think it was in Java 5, was add Java NIO, which is not thread per connection, but our HTTP connection handlers have not yet really taken advantage of this in a standard way.
Okay.
And so what we're doing is in Lifecycle Data Services, we have two different NIO-based channels that you can use to handle these connections. So we actually have our own HTTP and RTMP socket servers that do use NIO so that we're not bound to that thread per connection.
So the distinction at a very high level is that Blaze relies on servlet, Tomcat functionality, or Jetty, I guess you can employ whatever you want.
Yeah.
And you guys
It relies on the default HTTP connection handler, which is a thread per connection.
So could I cluster Blaze to get away from this?
You can, but 200 connections per
Yeah.
instance is just not at all feasible, right?
So
there are some open source projects that are trying to address this. One of those I think is Tomcat 6 specific, where to do scalable push, they're actually using Tomcat 6's NIO based connector. I don't know what the status of that one is. It's by Ferrata Systems is who's working on
what's
that.
that project called?
I don't know the name of it. Ferrata Systems announced it on their blog a few months ago.
Okay.
I don't know what the status of it is,
But
but
I assume you don't know when Tomcat 6 is going to ship.
I don't.
Ask the Adobe guy.
Yeah. So we're really, what Adobe is doing, Adobe's position on this is that as soon as Servlet 3 gets implemented and this functionality is standardized, then it's something that we'll build into our product. But we don't want to build something into our product that's Tomcat 6 specific, something that's very specific, and get into that. So we're waiting to build this into Blaze until the Servlet 3 spec has been finalized and the app servers have implemented this.
So I kind of want to focus on Blaze, but I'm kind of curious. Once that's in Blaze, is there a competitive advantage for Lifecycle?
So one of the features we haven't really talked about in Lifecycle Data Services is the data management service.
Okay.
It's essentially Hibernate for your rich internet application. So rather than thinking in terms of RPC method calls on my back end, which is what Remoti does, and instead of thinking in terms of publish and subscribe messaging, really what I want is a data management API where I have my data set, I make changes to it, those changes get sent to the server, and they get pushed out and keep all clients that have that data set in sync. That's what the data management set is for.
So you're managing client data state on the server through data management? Is that what you're describing? Or
You are keeping clients in sync by pushing changes out to the client when they happen on the server. So from a client programming perspective, I make a change to data. That change gets sent to the server. When that change successfully commits, it pushes out using our push mechanisms out to all the clients that have that data set on.
So really you're writing what I would implement behind push if I didn't use data management. I need to push something, but I have to have code that knows what to push.
Well, there's different uses for push, of course. Like if I'm pushing stock quotes, those are just going to be push. Or if I'm doing a chat application, those are just standard push. But a lot of times, what we're really working with is data.
Yeah.
And that data we have on the client, and when we make changes to that, we need to tell all the other clients about those changes. We need to get conflicts, if someone else has also made changes to that data.
So very Hibernate-y, like.
It's very Hibernate-y, like.
Nice.
It's essentially Hibernate for the client side of your application. Because now that you have another tier in your application stack, you have another tier where you have to worry about synchronization.
So is it dependent on Hibernate? I mean, is it an extension of Hibernate, or is it its own total?
It can extend Hibernate, but it can also work with any backend topology that you have.
Okay, interesting.
So that's one of the primary features of LCDS. Also, things like PDF generation, so being able to generate PDFs from your Flex application.
That would be
policy protect them.
Doing them client side versus the
server
side versus the client side API you referenced earlier. Yeah. Okay. So what about? I assume this is the same for Blaze and Lifecycle, but let us know if there's differences. What about securing my services? My services are essentially servlets, right?
Yeah.
And I map them through a web XML to then also Flex-specific deployment descriptors. What does it mean to secure them both from a user authentication and authorization standpoint, but also just to protect them from any person on the internet hitting that service?
Yeah, it is the same between LCDS and Blaze.
Okay.
And the way that it works is just using the standard constructs of your J2E application. So for instance, if I want to protect my AMF endpoint from only being able to be accessed by a someone who's authenticated, then in my web XML, I declare that, and I say this endpoint can only be accessed by someone in these roles or someone in all roles or
So
whatever.
with that though, you're basically saying that in the typical Flex application that's using Blaze or Lifecycle, you're more than likely going to use J2E or Spring Authentication or something on that
Yes,
side, right?
yeah, CG is used very frequently with Spring application, with applications using Spring. If you're using EJB session beans, then great, things are going to work well as well.
So it's really, in a lot of ways, from an architectural perspective, I know this is a big leap, but kind of a thought that's always in my head is, a lot of these are an extension of Java. Even if you take the Blaze DS deployment or lifecycle deployment, yes, I'm writing this new client-side language, but I'm really writing on a lot of things Java has to offer and a lot of these enterprise use cases.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's kind of a side point, but
Yeah.
okay. So is there anything else we should kind of talk about on Blaze, or?
No, I think that covers it. It's definitely great because if you're building something that uses remoting, uses messaging, with the exception of the scalability issues with messaging, then Blaze is a good option. It is LGPL, so some people have problems with that, and they can license our commercial product to deal with that. This is
Are all
traditional model that we see a lot of vendors with.
Sure. Is that the same, to the extent that you touched on licensing, is that the same for the Flex SDK? Is it LGP?
The Flex SDK is MPL. If you license, if you pay for Flex Builder, then you get the non-MPL license.
So why different licenses for those two?
For really, I think that when we decided on MPL for the Flex SDK, we were following what we had done with the Tamarind project, the Mozilla Tamarind project, which is under Mozilla, of course. And that was MPL. It was pretty natural to go MPL with Flex SDK. For Blaze DS, I think we got a little more adventurous, tried something that we hadn't done before.
A little off the tracks here, but since you brought up Tamarind, you might want to, maybe we should touch on what Tamarind is, and in terms of the conversation of, the openness and availability of the Flash player. That might be a good point to bring up here.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea to hop back there to some standardization stuff. So the Swift specification, the bytecode format, and things that Flash player reads, that format has been open so that anybody can build their own Flash player. It's been available for a long time, but there was a restriction. When you downloaded the specification, you had to agree not to build a Flash player. And we recently removed that restriction.
Is that the Open Screen project?
Yeah, the Open Screen project was the announcement that we made for taking Flash Player to mobile devices. And in order to do that, we wanted to open it up so that anyone could build their Flash Player. So opening up the Swift specification, this was a good first step in really opening Flash Player. But also, Flash Player has a virtual machine in it called Tamarind, Mozilla Tamarind. It's an open source project with Mozilla, and this executes that bytecode. So already we have a very mature and open virtual machine that we're using that anyone can come along and use to execute Swift files, to build all the video capabilities and vector capabilities and those sorts of things. Around that is really what is in Flash Player today and is still closed.
Yeah.
But there are open source implementations trying to get up to be level with Flash Player, like the Ganache project.
There's an interesting question there with deployment with other people building runtimes. How concerned should the average, if you take an enterprise application, you probably don't care about mobile, but totally kind of going off the tracks here. What should we expect in terms of mobile? Will I see a Flash player on the iPhone anytime soon? Is that coming in 09, 010?
I think we said that we got it working, so it's just a matter of Apple deciding that they.
So it's still Kevin Lynch's standard answer of talk to Mr. Jobs. And
yeah. So it's not up to us what goes on the iPhone.
Yeah,
we have Flash Player working on the iPhone, and hopefully it gets on there. But certainly there are tons of other mobile devices out there. iPhone, it's the newest and most exciting. but is nowhere near being the most adopted mobile device.
Sure.
So there are lots of other mobile devices that we're working on getting Flash Player onto. The Open Screen project is a big part of this. Also, even Windows Mobile, which is a massively adopted platform for mobile devices, they recently licensed Flash Lite, which isn't Flash Player, but is a subset of it. And so we are getting some pretty good traction in getting our runtimes onto mobile devices, and really this is going to be ramped up over the next few years.
So, stay on thread for one more minute. The Open Screen project, has the community kind of, when it first got announced, I think a lot of the community was confused as to what that meant.
Right.
Has there been a clarity that's come around that, or is it still just to the people outside Adobe? Right. Have you sensed or heard from people that are understanding the significance of that and why that matters to them?
I think most people are waiting to see what that really does for them.
Okay.
And I think hopefully over the next year or so, we will show them how this really impacts them.
So the general theme you're hearing is the proofs of the pudding, you know?
Right,
exactly. Do
That's
I get a greater availability of the runtime and those things?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Well, fair enough. So, sorry to derail us there. You just throw out a lot of interesting things that could be, once again, Scotch Talk's all in there.
Scotch Talk. That's what it's all about.
Yep. A hail to the Scotch Talk. I don't know how many times I want you to refill my Scotch on camera, but
5 or 6 would be
hopefully
fine.
my mother won't watch this.
Mothers don't watch us.
Yes.
Do our nerdy things.
It's too boring. So we'll run through these last few questions quick. I mean, we spent a lot of time. I think, we really could dive into many of these issues on their own, but
And maybe we will in future Scotch Talks.
exactly.
Cheers to that.
But I think a couple things that'll be really important to architects out there, of course, security constraints from a client-side perspective.
Right.
I'm in this sandbox. What does that mean to me? What are my limitations? What are my benefits of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because in the browser sandbox, it's a very comfortable place to build applications. You know that you don't have to worry about problems that are going to cause the user system to expose secure information. You have a lot less risk when you're in the sandbox, and that's one of the great things about Flash Player is that we're still in the browser sandbox. We still adhere to the browser sandbox rules.
So I hate to cut you off. I definitely want to hear the positive side. It seems like I hear more pain points of that rather than.
And there certainly are pain points, and I think that's why we created Air. Was if you do need to get out of that sandbox, then you do have a method to do that. If you are okay being in the sandbox, then Flash Player in the browser is a great place to be. The difference I think that some people see is that in the Java model, if I wanted to get out of the sandbox in the browser, all I had to do was sign my Java application, and then even though my application was still running in the browser as an applet, it could do anything that a normal Java application would do. We don't have that model in Flex. We have the model of there is a browser runtime that's sandbox. We have a desktop runtime that has a privileged sandbox.
And is that kind of, has Adobe concluded that's where they want to be with the runtime, or is it maybe a future objective to allow signed Flash applications?
It's something we've debated. I think that our current thinking is that really, if you want out of the sandbox, Air is your way to do that. There is some interesting things that you can do where you can have Air applications on the desktop communicate with Flex applications in the browser and do some communication between them. So that's some potential ways kind of out of the sandbox but still in the browser. And then also there is some great integration between your Air applications and your Flex applications. So if you go to parlays.com, if you haven't installed the Air application, it tells you you haven't. If you have installed it, then it tells you you can launch it right from the application. And Parlays also does the communication between the desktop and the web application. So I think Parlays is a great example.
Yeah, if you want to see a great example of using Air and Flash together, it's one of the best I've seen, because it's seeing that I watched this video even though I watched it in Air, and it's very cool.
Yeah.
So quickly, can you hit on some of the pain points that people do feel of being in the browser sandbox?
I think that one of those until Flash Player 10 was having to always do uploads directly to the server and downloads directly from the server. And now with Flash Player 10, that doesn't have to be the case. So that's one that we've heard, and now Flash Player 10 fixes. Another one is not having a good storage place for data. So let's say that I do have an application where this is a really simple one, but I have a combo box with all 50 states, and all those 50 states, I have really three options. I can build those 50 states into my application. I can load them from the server, or I can cache them locally. And depending on your use case, you may choose one. It may depend on which one you choose. But let's say you didn't want to save them locally. There is a mechanism to do that in Flash Player. It goes into a totally sandboxed place on the file system.
And is that in Flash 9 or is that new in Flash 10?
That's been in Flash for I don't know, probably 5.
So instead of just holding a
years.
reference on a singleton or whatever your pattern may be,
Right.
you can put it in some almost
Local
cookie-like.
storage. Yeah. It is essentially a big cookie.
Okay.
So it's in a sandbox place on the file system. You can read and write to it. Interestingly, so that websites don't maliciously consume lots of data, it is by default 100K. But you can ask the user if they'll grant you more space, and if they grant you 5 gigs, then you get 5 gigs. So interesting thing is that HTML5 and I think IE8 and Firefox 3 are starting to have this same kind of storage place as well. So it's something that's in Flash Player. It's not used very frequently. I think that I'd personally like to see it used more often, because if I'm having to wait around for 12 requests to go get these values that could be pulled instantaneously out of the file system, if those values are not changing very often and they're easy to deal with maintaining versioning of, then it may be a better option to store those locally.
Very cool. So last couple things I want to hit on, and maybe we can throw these together even though they're pretty separate issues. Accessibility and internationalization. What's there in the Flash Player? How strong is the accessibility story?
Yeah.
And just talk to us about those things.
So the accessibility of Flash is something that we are working hard on. I wouldn't say that it's perfect, but it's definitely something that we're working to make work well. It's a necessity for applications to work well. So JAWS works with Flash applications to be accessible, and I believe that only works in IE today. So I think that there are some standards out there that we're trying to
So
implement.
not available on the Mac then.
It may be. I'm not
Just
100%
give us a
positive.
Scotch is setting in.
It might not be one. It might be. Might not be. It's something that I'm sure that we document on our website. But I know for sure it works with JAWS on IE. So what Flex has done in order to hook into like tab ordering and visual or audible cues and all those sorts of things, the Flex framework has built accessibility pieces into the components. So things like combo boxes should work with only keys on the keyboard rather than having to work with a mouse, only with a mouse. So that's built into the Flex components. All the components, well, I shouldn't say all of them, most of them are accessible to people with disabilities using screen readers. The problem comes is that if I build my own components, I can easily break that accessibility. So there are accessibility APIs that you should implement if you're doing custom component development.
So there's hooks where I want to hook into if I extend, if I'm
Exactly.
have accessibility requirements.
Yeah. So we do have government organizations building large Flex applications that do have to be accessible, and they have had success with it. But just like anything else, you can screw it up if you don't think about this ahead of time.
In the traditional browser app conversation we've had a little bit throughout, is there challenges? Because I know that I haven't spent a lot of time in the accessibility arena, but when I've looked at it, it's very browser-centric, very HTML-centric.
Right.
Does that cause a problem, and just the fact that the new paradigm doesn't fit the rules?
I think that there's some element of that. I think that, certainly a lot of the standards were created with HTML in mind. And so it is a challenge to apply those standards to a non-HTML technology. But I think that as an industry, it'll evolve.
Yeah, but if you're a manager in a very internationalization? Is there built-in support?
Yeah, definitely. So with FlashBlade 10, we're adding the BiDi. So with the exception of BiDi, which hasn't been added to the Flex components yet, but with the exception of BiDi, the internationalization works great. It uses a very similar concept as we use in Java, resource bundles. So we don't put exact strings in our applications. We map to resource bundle values. We can load those resource bundles depending on the user's locale.
So it sounds very Java-y.
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent to know.
Yeah.
Well, coming to a close here, is there anything else you think that in general you would think would be worth speaking to for managers or architects out there considering adopting Flex for their applications?
I think we've covered a lot of the major stuff. I mean, if you have questions, definitely feel free to email me. Maybe it's something that we bring up on future Scotch Talks, or maybe something that we just email directly about. But my email, jaward@adobe.com. And so if you want to email me, feel free.
And you can also find James's blog at jamesward.com.
Yeah.
I like that one as jamesward.org, but
You can still use it through jamesward.org.
I still do. It's very important to me too.
That's right. I sold out and went commercial.
You did. We're glad you made it to the end, if you did. I don't know why. But
If you did, go enjoy Scotch.
Yes. Thank you for watching Scotch Talk. I'm John Ward. No, I'm actually John Rose,
John
and this
Rose.
is
James Ward.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.